to and from not just the station, but the sort of the heart of the community where the station's going to be. Another interesting aspect of this is the Federal Transit Administration, which is the federal part of the Federal Department of Transportation that deals with funding light rail projects all over the country. Sound Transit is very familiar with FTA. Basically put out a rule a few years ago that basically said all pedestrian improvements located within a quarter mile and all bicycle improvements located within 3 miles of public transit stop should have a functional relationship to the station. So they kind of defined not just a walk shed, as Sarah was talking about, but sort of like also like sort of a bike shed. So I just thought it would be sort of interesting to plot out, well, what does that look like? So I have circles in my presentation too, but here's your station. So this is your quarter mile radius. That's a pretty comfortable walking distance for most people, right? I mean, that's about 1,200, 1,300 feet. So your quarter mile radius, that's taking you to about I-5. It's taking you over to about 15th up to just north of 70th. So then what's your half mile radius look like? So your half mile walk radius, which is kind of I think what Sarah talked about in her presentation, you know, it starts to think a little bigger, right? Now you're getting into a lot of Green Lake. And so this station's probably going to serve a lot of people who also live over in this part of town, right? It's taking you over to 20th. It's taking you north up to 75th. And then what does a mile look like? A mile radius north-south probably doesn't make very much sense in terms of station access because like the university station is essentially right there. It's at 43rd in Brooklyn. So north-south, you're starting to get up to where close to the Northgate station, close to the University District station south. But from an east-west standpoint, you know, think about that. If you live over here, this is still going to be your closest station to get to, right? You're still going to have to, and so that's starting to be, that can be a comfortable walk for some people, but a lot of people may not want to walk a mile. So that may be starting to think about your sort of bike or transit. And then just for fun, this 3 mile radius, which was how the FTA defined the bike shed, well, that's actually starting to overlap with, not surprisingly, with a lot of the other link stations, right? So if you live, you know, there, you're probably, if you go on a, you know, walk or bike, you're not going to go to Roosevelt, you're probably going to go to Northgate and vice versa. But again, from an east-west connectivity, you know, if you're over here or over here, for example, that's still maybe your closest station destination. I actually, just for fun, Google Maps told me I live 2.8 miles from here. So I biked here this morning from about here in North Ballard, and just to sort of, you know, test out that radius. So thinking about the different types of modes that have to be accommodated, what factors go into thinking about this, and this is really where you start to get into kind of the granular level. What is really important for pedestrians at not just the station, but really the heart of the community? Well, a lot of it's obviously connectivity. You know, like how far apart are crossings? That's a huge issue for pedestrians, right? The width of sidewalks and queuing areas. You know, light rail stations are huge pedestrian generators. So when people are getting on and off, particularly when a lot of people are getting off, then that sort of width of the sidewalk is really important. I mean, one of the problems we're having, like for example, at the Mount Baker station, is Franklin High School is right across the street from the station. The sidewalks are super narrow, and when a bunch of students come out to get on the train, it's really challenging for them to just literally stand and wait. It's not safe because the sidewalks are not wide enough, which really gets into this sort of crossing issue. You know, that's really, for pedestrians, like the biggest thing you have to think about. You know, now you're entering the street realm, you're crossing the street. What's going to make that crossing feel safe? And there's a lot of really important design treatments that have to happen. Lighting's super important. If you're getting on and off the train at night, you want that area to feel safe. And that's a huge issue for transit patrons all over the place. And then to the point you guys are talking about today, you really want the uses around that station, and this is what Sarah was talking about, to kind of activate the area and kind of make it feel safe. And of course, weather protection, huge issue here in the Northwest when it's raining. We also have to consider the needs of everybody who needs to get to the station. So things like curb ramps and accessibility, et cetera, et cetera. Bicycle access, which Sarah talked about a little bit as well. So what kinds of facilities will make people feel safe to be able to bike to the station? Then parking has to be there. Parking has to be there both for people who want to bike to support the businesses and shop, and that's something I experience a lot in Ballard as a Ballard resident. I bike a lot to downtown Ballard, and I want to have convenient parking to bike. But also, people can take their bikes on Sound Transit trains, but since this is a tunnel station, a lot of people who bike to and from the station will want to park their bikes at the station, so having safe, convenient bike parking is really important. And then ultimately, I think the city's vision is to have bike share, which is now there's only about 50 bike share stations, have a bike share station at every light rail station. Because that's typically how bike share is thought about in cities like Chicago, New York, London, that have very large and sophisticated, essentially as an extension of the public transit system. In Chicago, where I'm from, and I think where Sarah's from, there are bike share stations at virtually every L station in the system. And it's kind of, again, it's really for that first last mile connecting place. Transit access, super important. I think it's super important at this station. So how are you going to be able to get from bus to rail? So one of the things that's happening right now as part of the opening of Link to the Capitol Hill station and then the Husky Stadium station, which will be early next year, correct, is Metro is working with Sound Transit to reconfigure bus routing based on that station. And I think a lot of that will have to happen here, and particularly at Northgate, right? Because Northgate is such a major regional, and a lot of those routes will have to be rethought about. So Metro will probably work on updating that service plan closer to the opening of the station here in 2021. But right now, and you live here, so you're probably more familiar with these transit routes than I am, but kind of thinking about the high frequency transit routes, particularly the east-west routes, I think that east-west transit connectivity is going to be really super important, right, to get right as the station opens. Finally, the last thing Jim asked me to talk about was kind of the streetscape concept plan for the kind of heart of the station area at 66th. So streetscape concept plans are something that we and the Department of Planning and Development work together on, generally as part of community planning processes. They're really intended to provide direction to the private sector, the development community, other agencies, in this case Sound Transit, and to us about what do we want to see the street look like when we develop that street. They're adopted by director's rule by both the Department of Planning and Development and SDOT, and they live in a document called the Right-of-Way Improvement Manual, which is actually our design standards document. So there was a streetscape concept plan developed for 66. Many of you may have been involved with that and know more about it than I do. It essentially extends from 15th Avenue out to 8th. Here's the station right here at 12th and 65th, 67th. Here's 66. Here's one of the future TOD sites that Thatcher will be talking about. And so then just sort of drilling down more, so here's the section of 66, here's your station right here, here's one of the major TOD sites. So kind of thinking about, this is where you really get into the nuances of design, right? I mean, the sidewalk width, what kind of, how to make these crossings feel safe, so curb bulbs is one way to do that, to sort of shorten the crossing distance. We've been working a lot with Sound Transit as they've been through the 90% design process, really cooperative. They want to make the design of this really fit with the 66th Avenue streetscape concept. And then how this TOD project happens is a really important link to making that streetscape concept plan work as well, right? And then still a lot of questions about this street, like if we're going to have a bike share station at the station, does it make sense to put it here somewhere? Does it make sense to put somewhere else? And then, as a lot of you know, and I think Thatcher will talk about, I think there's some public plaza development here as part of the station. How does that work to enhance not just the station area, but really, again, all the development that's going to happen around that station and the future TOD site? So I think that's stuff to think about. So I know a lot of the questions you'll be grappling with today get to land use and the types of land use, and I think that's what your survey that Jim and the other folks put together is about. I guess what I would pose is you think about land use, what are the types of improvements that should be made or prioritized for better station community access and to support those TOD projects. So thank you, and thank you all for being here this morning, and I'll turn it over to Thatcher at this point.
I'll just say thank you, Kevin, and I'm going to get Thatcher Imboden from Sound Transit set up. He's got a PowerPoint presentation as well, and then we'll be transitioning into a discussion topic. Thatcher, please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Thatcher Imboden with Sound Transit. I work in the TOD, the Transit-Oriented Development Group within the agency. I'm new to the region, so I represent 4 of those 5 million, or projected growth people, came here from Minneapolis. And so when we'll get going here in a second. I'm also joined here today by Ron Englich and Kristen Hoffman of Sound Transit, who many of you probably know from the light rail development side. So transit-oriented development, Sarah talked about this a little bit in the beginning, but really it's a new term for something that's very familiar. Neighborhoods like Roosevelt grew up around things like the streetcar. And so these buildings that got built back in the early 1900s really kind of represented the fact that most people experience the city via their feet, their 2 feet just walking around. And so today, after years of the car, we're kind of re-emerging talking about pedestrians and bikes and buses and light rail. So TOD is a land development pattern. It's really about people, it's about places, and it's about transit. What we're doing is we're looking at things like real estate densities. We're looking at how people experience it on the street. The former QFC used to have a big parking lot between the building and the street and the sidewalk. And now today, the transit-oriented development we typically talk about, we're talking about buildings that come up right up against the sidewalk that usually have very active ground floor uses, whether it's retail or restaurants or office space or medical space. It typically are multiple stories. Usually they have less priority on things like parking with major mass transit investment and the kind of substantial change that's going to take place with your mobility at Roosevelt to be able to get very quickly to downtown or to Northgate or to the university or even to the airport. That is going to change how people perceive how they can move around in the region, and it's going to give you a lot more access to jobs. It's going to give you a lot more access to cultural institutions, and it's going to give you access to shopping and things of that sort. So Sound Transit is a transit development agency, but transit and land use, the way that you experience the city as people, are directly linked. And so while we're really focused on getting your mobility improved via transit investments, we're also thinking about things like transit-oriented development and how you're going to experience it when you're not riding the train. And so in 2012, the Sound Transit Board adopted a TOD policy that kind of directs staff to work thinking about how you're going to experience the city throughout our transit development and planning process. We also have a strategic plan that was adopted in 2014 that gave it a little bit more specific. Sound Transit has had, we can approach transit-oriented development in a number of different ways. One is there's everything that is going to take place around the station on land that we don't own. That we generally see as kind of the community transit-oriented development. Those are projects that you are already seeing in your neighborhood, the growth that's going on. And then there's agency transit-oriented development. That's transit-oriented development that happens on land that we own. When we build light rail the stations, we had to buy a number of different parcels to facilitate the station. In addition, we needed land to stage for all the construction. And so when we're done constructing it, we often end up with either little pieces or big pieces, and in the case of Roosevelt, we have at least one big piece of land that I'll be talking about in a moment. And so we have examples kind of throughout the region where we have done transit-oriented development on our own land, and typically that, what we do is we'd go out and we'd find a real estate development partner that would build something. So the one up here is Senior City. That was constructed down in Federal Way on land next to the Federal Way Transit Center. These pictures are a little dark, but it's 62 units of affordable senior housing. Mount Baker Lofts, which ArtSpace developed at the Mount Baker station. It is artist housing, live-work unit built on the former, Firestone tire site. And then Othello Plaza will start construction this fall down in the Othello Station area. And it is a mix, two different buildings connected at the base by one kind of shared space, and they'll have different levels of affordable housing in that area. So in general, we kind of look at the transit development and planning cycle as kind of system planning, project design and construction, and then finally getting rid of the excess property that we might have at the end. Right now, Roosevelt is in the construction phase. And the way that Sound Transit has previously kind of approached transit-oriented development on our land is that once we're fully done with the construction of a project, we would turn it over and say, okay, now it's time to get rid of the land. And so there's sometimes a pause between the time that the station opens and the time that something will actually be built on the surplus land. Here, I think the Sound Transit staff have really been trying to focus on how can we do that a little bit differently. How can we make it so that you don't have an extended construction cycle where the land just sits vacant once the station opens. And so we are talking about it now, trying to say, okay, well, the land's not going to be available for a little while. Why don't we use the time now, to kind of plan for what could happen on that land and try to make it so that the second that we don't need the land, which I'll talk more about in a few minutes, we can give it over to a developer who can try to meet some of the community's needs and meet the Sound Transit's policy needs. So this is a very dark map, but there's an overlay of kind of just generally speaking where the station is. So here's 65th, 70th is up here, 12th, and Roosevelt. So we're going to end up having potentially three sites after the construction is complete that will be available for transit-oriented development. The stations are on the 12th side of the site, and then we have kind of three parcels. One, parcel C is up here on the north. It's 67th and 12th. There's a little piece of land, very small, on the south side of 66, just west of the station, and then the big one, which is really where QFC used to be located. Once we're done with construction staging, will be available for development. And we'll talk more about this in a second, but just as a reminder, I want to talk a little bit more about the Roosevelt Station to give some context to how these individual extra parcels kind of relate to what you're going to be experiencing when you're taking the light rail. So this north's at the right, and so you have 65th, and you've got 67th. The main entrances are on the kind of the north end of the site towards 67th, and another one down at 65th. There'll be a bunch of bike parking kind of right here off of 66th, which is the Green Street. There's also an art plaza on the south side, and then you have the high school down here. So this is a rendering from 65th Street, where you'll be able to enter off the corner, and you can kind of see the art piece in the background. The gray box is just intended to kind of show where a transit-oriented development project, if that was built to the kind of the maximum zoning envelope, would be. Again, because looking at 66th, this is the 12th that the biker is on. That's the art plaza, and then the bike plaza there. The art plaza, again, this is, I think, intended to kind of be an area that people will gather. There'll be opportunities to kind of wait if you're being picked up by somebody, or maybe if you're going to meet somebody before you go down into the station. This would be a real great place to gather. Entrance to the station, and down on the platform level. So this is coming, and it's going to give you an incredible access to places very soon. All right, so a little bit more about the site, what we're really interested in talking about today. So Sound Transit has kind of anticipated that construction staging on Site B, which is the middle site, the old QFC, is likely to be kind of wrapped up right around 2020. And the station's not opening until 2021. And so we have the opportunity to kind of queue it up so that we can try to get any kind of construction activity with it to take place for a transit-oriented development project happening before the station actually opens up for you to use. And so the other sites, A, which is a small parcel, about 5,300 square feet, and Site C, which is 6,100 square feet, is unlikely to be available until 2021 or just slightly later, depending on when construction staging wraps up, and that we are not fully aware of exactly when that will be. So for purposes of today's conversation, we're mostly focused on Site B, the largest site. It was also the site that has the most potential to have be able to advance community and economic development goals for this community because of its size and ability to accommodate those goals. So our process, how we approach transit-oriented development is we need to be able to answer, what should it accomplish? So we'll talk more about this particular one because that's where we are today in a moment. Secondly, we often will look and say, well, what could it look like? So to accomplish those goals, how would we do it? How would it look like? We've done some of that already because of the complications of building next to an underground station. There's a lot of technical components that have to be considered to make sure that the development doesn't negatively impact the station. And then once we've kind of decided what we're trying to get, we will try to figure out how individual projects, usually through some sort of request for proposals process, an RFP process, how well do those projects meet those goals? And so that's kind of like the major next steps. That's kind of what we're going to be doing. So in terms of what should it accomplish, we have to understand there's a lot of different stakeholders. There's Sound Transit as an agency. We have our policy, and we have policy guidance. There is recent legislation that has taken place around ST3 that talks about affordable housing, and we have to interpret that. There are existing city policies. There's zoning. There are a variety of different documents like the Roosevelt Design Review Guidelines, the Roosevelt Neighborhood Streetscape Concept Plan that Kevin talked about. There's the Roosevelt Neighborhood Plan and Update. There'll be community engagement that we will do. This is kind of the beginning of a process. This is something that Roosevelt Neighborhood Association, this meeting today, has organized to kind of say, we need to start thinking about these things. We need to think about what the community's priorities are. We will have a community engagement process as when we go forward with trying to bring a developer on to realize these goals. And this is one piece of input. So there'll be additional opportunities for you. So today is not the only time we will be talking about transit-oriented development in Roosevelt. In addition, we have FTA guidelines. We used FTA dollars for this project. And so there are certain requirements that come with it when you're using federal money in the disposition process, as well as state laws. In terms of process, let's see. I don't know if you guys can read this, but right now we're kind of in this end of 2015 period. And so over the last couple of years at different times, we've been evaluating kind of technical considerations about what is the site that was going to be available for surplus after the fact. What kind of considerations would a developer or someone building on that site need to take into account as it relates to underground parking or their the support systems that hold up their building, because we have a large station underground. We're just starting the community engagement process, I guess, by being here today, and we will be providing more information as we kind of go into 2016 about specific meetings and survey opportunities that we will do to solicit additional information. We are likely to go out and try to get a development partner for the site in 2016. That's not imminent right now, but it is something just to be aware of, that we will probably be doing that. You'll get more definition on that when we kind of nail down our community engagement process. And then, again, as the stuff in dark blue kind of represents Site B, which is that we are anticipating kind of at the end of 2019 or early 2020 that we'd be able to actually sell the land or lease the land to a developer who could start building their building. And so if the station is becoming operational kind of towards Q3 or so of 2021, the hope is that we'd have a building that could open at the same time. So that would minimize the amount of construction impacts on the community. And then on the other sites, A and C, it'd be a little too early for us to go out until probably about 2018, 2019 to bring somebody on. So we're not really going to talk too much about it. We imagine that it'll be brought up in the discussions when we go through, but given that there'll be a lag between the time of 2016 to 2018, we expect that we'd be going back and kind of making sure that our assumptions are correct. So next steps, identify community priorities. This process will help RNA understand kind of what it thinks is important. We will do our community engagement process that we will define over the next few months to kind of add additional input on that. And then we need to figure out what we as a staff will do is try to interpret all the different policies and all the community engagement that's been done to try to come up with what should our procurement methods look like. Because really, our role as community or as TOD staff is advancing community and economic development next to transit. And so we need to figure out how to do that. Our procurement model is our ability to do that. That is how we translate big picture goals to trying to realize something. And then we'll have a private partner, or maybe it's a nonprofit partner, who will come in and say, this is what we're going to do. And this is how we think we can achieve those goals. So that's kind of, this is an important, step 2 is kind of an important translation. And lastly, we'll go out and, as I said, we'll procure a developer who will help implement that plan. Thank you.
Great. Thatcher, thank you. It's clear to me that Sound Transit is evolving its transit-oriented development program, and the idea of timing a project on the large site to coincide even close to the opening of the rail operation, it's very interesting, and I think that the community would benefit from that so that we're not torn up any longer than possible. Okay, these are great presentations. We're on track time-wise. I hope you can see how we've kind of started up in the clouds at the regional level with Sarah's discussion about, the Puget Sound Regional Council perspective on growth management and the strategies for building vibrant communities. Kevin O'Neill from SDOT has helped us understand, the access to the station, and people have already been asking questions about that. Well, if you're not going to put a parking lot there, and we're not, how do people come to and from? There's some big questions and some more things to be worked out. And Sound Transit, of course, will have their sleeves rolled up and working on the nuts and bolts of figuring out what happens on these sites. And so we're really going to be focusing at this point and in the near term on that one large TOD site, Site B, as in boy, the old QFC lot. And so, the outcome of this process in front of us, as Thatcher explained, is for the community to begin to distill its general priorities. And so, to that end, we're going to do a couple things here, but we want to direct your attention to the survey document that's on the tables. There's a box downstairs. This will also be published in the RUSI, and we're trying to discern, your general priorities for this site, understanding that, it's challenging for the Sound Transit Agency to say, I want a petting zoo, to be that specific. It kind of boxes them in. So it's much more constructive for us to say, we think that these types of things should happen near transit. It makes sense to me. This is the type of stuff that would make our neighborhood more vibrant. This is the kind of neighborhood I have in mind. So it's those general priorities that we're most trying to get at. At the same time, the average neighbor needs to think in specific terms. I mean, a water feature, how cool. Let's be sure to get a water feature. Well, tell us if you like that. And then there's some other questions just designed to draw out some of your preferences and priorities. So it's not a scientific survey. We've done the best we can, but I can tell you that Sound Transit is very interested in this information. And so let's do the surveys now, later, as you have a chance. I think there'll be a deadline of probably December 1, Gina, is that right? Because of the RUSI cycle. So just a couple other comments, and we're going to open it up here. I personally think that the Green Street designations that Kevin pointed out, and I might pull that slide up again, are a really important component of TOD. Again, Northeast 66th Street from 15th, right in front of the high school, all the way west to 8th is a designated Green Street, and there's this fabulous work document, the Green Street Concept Plan, which exists. If you've walked down Northeast 66th Street, west of Roosevelt, on the south side, past the Cavella apartment building and the brand new Rooster apartment building, you see how wide those sidewalks are. You see how comfortable that is. Especially it's true on 65th with Rooster, but I'm talking about 66. Those buildings, if I understand, were built in compliance compliance with the streetscape concept guidelines. There's a hint of what happens when the plans are affected. These plans have teeth, they have weight, and I think that 66th Street, this is a personal opinion, has the potential to be a wonderfully friendly and relatively quiet back street to 65th, which will always be a busy arterial. Think about 66 as a wonderful part of the community. I do. And I think that TOD is a big piece of that. You know, whatever happens on Site B, where the QFC supermarket used to be, I feel needs to embrace the Green Street. And, you know, I might go so far, again, these are personal observations, that the high school, you know, and we're going to have a bit of a pocket park in front of the school on 14th. Think about just kind of an expanded civic commons. It's a grandiose notion, but I'm asking you to dream a little bit at this point about what you want for this neighborhood, because the opportunities are substantial. They're exciting. And so as a way to get into that, I've got one more special guest here, and I'm not going to, you know, put him, well, I am going to put him on the spot just to talk with us a little bit.